Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Jackson, Part 4, His Final Years. We stopped last time in 1833 when Jackson was inaugurated for the second time for his second term. And in his inaugural address on March 2nd, 1833, President Jackson said, quote, "My experience in public concerns and the observation of a life somewhat advanced confirm the opinions long since imbibed by me that the destruction of our state governments or the annihilation of their control over the local concerns of the people would lead directly to revolution and anarchy and finally to despotism and military domination. Solemnly impressed by these considerations, my countrymen will ever find me ready to exercise my constitutional powers in arresting measures which may directly or indirectly encroach upon the rights of the states, or tend to consolidate a political power in the general government. But of equal and indeed incalculable importance is the union of these states, and the sacred duty of all to contribute to its preservation by a liberal support of the general government in the exercise of just powers. Without union, our independence and liberty would never have been achieved. Without union, they can never be maintained. Divided into 24 or even a smaller number of separate communities, we shall see our internal trade burdened with numberless restraints and exactions, communication between distant points and sections obstructed or cut off, our sons made soldiers to deluge with blood the fields they now till in peace." So he's talking about the preservation of the state governments and also the importance of the federal government. Jackson biographer John Meacham wrote, quote, "Andrew Jackson was well suited for the demands of the White House. He was strong and shrewd, patriotic and manipulative, clear-eyed and determined. If the different parts of the country would surrender something dear to them for the sake of a larger cause, then they would be repaid with more liberty, more prosperity, and more happiness than if each element chose to guard its selfish interests, sacrificing the whole and foreclosing the possibilities of democracy." In June of 1833, President Jackson went on a tour of the North, and he went to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York City, and Boston. He was very popular during that trip. And a newspaper regarding President Jackson wrote, quote, "He appeared to feel as a father surrounded by a numerous band of children, happy in their affections and loving them with a parent's love. Such are the impressions left by the visit of Andrew Jackson." In New York City, President Jackson said, quote, "What a country God has given us. How thankful we ought to be that God has given us such a country to live in. We have the best country and the best institutions in the world. No people have so much to be grateful for. But there is one thing that I fear will yet sap the foundation of our liberty. That monster institution, the Bank of the United States. Its existence is incompatible with liberty. One of the two must fall, the bank or our free institutions. Next Congress and effort to effect a recharter will be renewed, but my consent they will never have." Again, he was in Boston. He went to Harvard, where he received that honorary degree, and he said at Harvard, quote, "I shall have to speak in English, not being able to return your compliment in what appears to be the language of Harvard. All the Latin I know is e pluribus unum, from many one, the national motto, and the students had a long, loud applause by that remark. Andrew Jackson said in 1833, quote, "My wife was a pious Christian woman. She gave me the best advice, and I have not been unmindful of it. When the people in their sovereign power elected me President of the United States, she said to me, 'Don't let your popularity turn your mind away from the duty you owe God. Before Him we are all alike sinners, and to Him we must all alike give account. All these things will pass away, and you and I and all of us must stand before God.'" 1833, claims against the Kingdom of Naples and Denmark were settled. The Turkish ports were open to U.S. shipping, a treaty with Siam, now called Thailand, the first between the U.S. and an Asian nation, became law. And the British West Indies were open to trade with the United States. These were all major achievements of President Jackson. Also in 1833, Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio opened. It was the first American college open to blacks and whites, men and women. In 1833, there were, that year and otherwise, up till now, the public could come and watch the Senate in action from the second floor gallery. And there was a sign there in 1833, and the sign said this, quote, "Gentlemen will be pleased not to place their feet on the board in front of the gallery, as dirt from them falls upon senators' heads." Now, President Jackson faced assassination threats. There was a woman named Mrs. Gadsby who organized a volunteer lady army to protect President Jackson with broomsticks. Now, there was a rumor that a mob was approaching from Baltimore, and an anti-Jackson mob. And President Jackson said that, quote, he would, quote, would in person meet them at the head of Mrs. Gadsby's corps of old women, armed with broomsticks at Bladensburg, and drive them back. In March of 1833, France, which the French Parliament voted not to repay $5 million to the U.S. for damages to U.S. shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. American ships had been taken, and there were damages. And the French actually agreed. Then later they said, "Oh no, we're not going to pay." Now President Jackson got tough, and he spoke very hard and threatened action. And there was a danger of war with France. And the French capitulated, and they paid that $5 million. So that was a major achievement, again, by President Jackson. January of 1835, President Jackson survived the first assassination attempt on a sitting U.S. president. Richard Lawrence was a disturbed house painter, and he shot a Derringer pistol at Jackson, which misfired. And then after firing, President Jackson charged him with his cane. There was a rumor that Lawrence was connected to the U.S. Bank, unconfirmed. Now, this Richard Lawrence was mentally ill after he was arrested. He said that President Jackson had killed his father, and then later he said that he was the heir to the British throne, and Andrew Jackson stood in his way. Summer of 1834, like every summer during that era, it would empty because of the intolerable heat and contagious fevers of July, August, and September. 1835, a major achievement. 1835 was another major achievement of President Jackson. The federal government paid off its debt in full, and for the first time, the U.S. government was debt-free. The government had gone into debt going back to the Revolution. Finally, the debt was paid off, January of 1835. And President Jackson made this a high priority to pay down the debt, to pay off the debt, to cut expenses, and he achieved that major achievement by Andrew Jackson. And this was important for the morale of the country and for its respect around the world. 1835, Charleston, South Carolina, there was a mail delivery of thousands of anti-slavery tracts, pamphlets sent by the abolitionist movement, the Anti-Slavery Society. Mobs broke into the post office in Charleston, and they got these pamphlets, these tracts. They had a bonfire and burned them. And Lewis and Arthur Tappan, two abolitionist brothers, were burned in effigy as well. Tappan Square at Oberlin, Ohio, is named after Lewis and Arthur Tappan, the abolitionist leaders. So this was the ongoing conflict over slavery, which eventually led to the Civil War. December of 1835 was the start of the Second Seminole War in Florida. Chief Osceola was the leader of the Seminole Indians. 100 American soldiers were killed. And the war went on for 7 years. It was the longest and most expensive Indian war. The Cherokee removal was ongoing. A treaty was signed, and there were to remove the Cherokee Indians west. In 1838, that happened. There were 16,000 Cherokee Indians that traveled west to Oklahoma, and 4,000 died on the way. So this was really a tragedy. One Georgia volunteer who was a part of the military escort of the Cherokees said, quote, "I fought through the Civil War and seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." This was the Trail of Tears. December of 1835, President Jackson's two adopted sons and their families were both living in the White House. Andrew and Emily Donaldson and their 4 children, and Andrew and Sarah Jackson Jr. with their 2 children. So this was wonderful. This was his family. There's a story. He visited the orphan asylum with his grandchildren in Washington. It was supposedly he spoiled his grandchildren, and his daughter-in-law Emily said, quote, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." And Andrew Jackson responded, quote, "I think, Emily, with all due deference to the good book, that love and patience are better disciplinarians than rods." March 2nd, 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. A lot of European descent Americans had moved into Texas, which was part of Mexico, and they declared their independence. This led to war between Texas and Mexico. March 6th, the Mexican army stormed the Alamo, a Texan fort. And Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and 185 Americans died in that fighting. And in the following month, April 20th and 21st, the Texan Army, led by Sam Houston, defeated the Mexican Army, led personally by Mexican dictator Santa Anna, who became a prisoner. Before the fighting, Sam Houston had said to the Texas troops, quote, "Victory is certain. Trust in God and fear not. And remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo." So this is when Texas became an independent country, before it later joined the U.S. September of 1836, Jackson's daughter-in-law, Emily Donaldson, was very ill with tuberculosis. She died in December of 1836 at age 29. This was a real tragedy. She was like a daughter for Andrew Jackson. 1836 was a presidential election year, and Martin Van Buren, who was reportedly Andrew Jackson's hand-picked successor, was elected president. And of course, Jackson's term went on through March of 1837. His final battle was to erase the Senate 1834 censure of him, which was like a formal criticism of him, which was connected to the Bank War. So that censure was expunged from the record, and that was considered a victory by him. Before his term came to an end, President Jackson recognized the independence of Texas, which had been a Mexican territory. His last public reception, and there was a boisterous crowd that came into the White House and hacked to pieces a 1,400-pound cheese. Thomas Meacham of Sandy Creek, Oswego County, New York, gave President Jackson the mammoth cheddar cheese, which weighed 1,400 pounds. At the levee, or public party, honoring George Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1836, the cheese was available for public consumption. The Globe newspaper reported, quote, "All you heard was cheese. All you smelled was cheese. The carpets were slippery with cheese. Pockets were filled with balls of the stuff, and the very air for half a mile around was permeated with the aroma of cheese. The mob demolished the cheddar within 2 hours and left only a few scraps to grace the presidential table." So Martin Van Buren was inaugurated as the 8th U.S. president in March of 1837, and the crowd was coming to say goodbye to Andrew Jackson. They were cheering him. Thomas Benton wrote, quote, that the tribute was such, quote, as never a tribute such as power never commanded, nor man in power received. It was affection, gratitude, and admiration. So he was extremely popular with this crowd as he was leaving to go home after the end of his presidency. In his farewell address, President Jackson said, quote, "I thank God that my life has been spent in a land of liberty, and that he has given me a heart to love my country with the affection of a son. March 7th, he left the White House for his home, the Hermitage, outside of Nashville, Tennessee. For the final 8 years of his life, he was very busy advising his successors, Martin Van Buren, and then he was pushing for the annexation of Texas, and he had lots of political correspondence. July of 1838, Andrew Jackson formally joined the Presbyterian Church. January 8th of 1840 was the Silver Jubilee, the 25-year anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, and Jackson, despite his age, his old age and poor health, traveled to New Orleans, tough trip, for the celebration. Jackson believed that January 8th should be a national holiday, like the 4th of July. Actually, yesterday was the 8th. It was the 205th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans on January 8th, 1815. 1844, well, in 1840, William Henry Harrison and the Whigs had been elected, and then Harrison died, and John Tyler finished out his term. 1844 was another U.S. presidential election, and Andrew Jackson supported James K. Polk, who won the election. Polk had said that he favored Texas annexation. Before the end of his term in office, President Tyler was able to work for the annexation through joint resolution in Congress of Texas shortly in March of 1845. Andrew Jackson was very happy about this. He said, quote, "I not only rejoice but congratulate my beloved country. Texas is reannexed, and the safety, prosperity, and the greatest interest of the whole Union is secured by this great and important national act." In his final years, he was an old guy, and he had a lot of health troubles. He'd had health troubles for many years, and they got a lot worse. Richard Norton Smith wrote, quote, "Somehow the old man soldiered on, notwithstanding frequent abscesses caused by 2 bullets lodged in his body from a youthful duel, bleeding in the lungs, malarial fever, chronic dysentery, severe toothache, malnutrition, and dropsical habits, which caused his feet and ankles to swell. To the end, that man remained faithful to his political creed. When a returning naval officer offered the former president an elaborate sarcophagus originally made for the Roman Emperor Severus, Jackson's refusal was instantaneous. My Republican feelings and principles forbid it. The simplicity of our government forbids it." Near the end of his life, Jackson took to singing almost incessantly. His favorite song was Auld Lang Syne. "Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and the days of Auld Lang Syne? And the days of Auld Lang Syne, my dear, and the days of Auld Lang Syne. Should old acquaintance be forgot and the days of Auld Lang Syne." Auld Lang Syne means the old days, old acquaintance, old friends and loved ones. So should we forget the old days and departed loved ones? No, we should not. That's the unstated answer. Now, Jackson suffered from dropsy. At times, swelling of his body. At times, his body was swollen almost twice its normal size. Very uncomfortable. He complained that he was one blubber from head to foot. Near the end of his life, there were public requests for locks of his hair. So every time he had a haircut, the hair clippings were saved and given to the public who made requests for them. Near the end of his life, Andrew Jackson said, quote, "Sir, I am in the hands of a merciful God. I have full confidence in his goodness and mercy. My lamp of life is nearly out, and the last glimmer has come. I'm ready to depart when called. The Bible is true." Andrew Jackson died on June 8, 1845, at his home, the Hermitage, near Nashville, Tennessee, at age 78. He was buried in the garden at the Hermitage. His last words reportedly were, "I hope to see you all in heaven, both white and black, both white and black." There were before he died, there were lots of people in the room, white and black people. He had these slaves and so forth. There were 3,000 people at his funeral at the Hermitage. A visitor asked one of Jackson's slaves if he thought Jackson went to heaven, and reportedly the slave said, quote, "If the general wants to go, who's to stop him?" Shortly after his death, Sam Houston, who had served with him in the war fighting against Indians at Horseshoe Bend, arrived. He knew that he'd gotten news that Andrew Jackson was dying. He came, but arrived shortly after the death of Jackson, and he had his young son with him. And he said, quote, "My son, try to remember that you have looked upon the face of Andrew Jackson." Now, regarding his funeral, Burke Davis wrote, quote, "There was an awkward pause as the mourners gathered on the shaded lawn. A withering blast of profanity and obscenity came from the gallery above, where the parrot, Old Poll, the general's favorite of many years, stood sentry on the porch." Regarding his wife Rachel, Jackson had said, quote, "Heaven will be no heaven if she is not there." After his death, his estate, the estate that was left behind, included the Hermitage, his home, 1,000 acres, 50 acres of cedar timber, and then in Wilson County, Mississippi, a plantation of 2,700 acres, 110 slaves there. At the Hermitage, 51 slaves, also 50 horses, 400 hogs, 180 sheep, and 100 cattle. Jackson biographer Robert V. Ramini wrote, quote, "Andrew Jackson altered the history of the United States and profoundly assisted its rise to greatness. More than most presidents, he symbolized for his own time the strength and power and perpetuity of American democracy. And yet, as Herman Melville pointed out, he was picked up from the common clay and thundered higher than a throne. He proved for all time the reality and splendor of the American dream." William Cullen Bryant, a poet and editor, wrote about Jackson, quote, "Faults he had, undoubtedly, such faults as often belong to an ardent, generous, sincere nature, the weeds that grow in rich soil. Notwithstanding, he was precisely the man for the period in which he well and nobly discharged the duties demanded of him." After his death, Levi Woodbury wrote, quote, "The victor in 100 battles has at last fallen. The pilot who weathered the storm in the fiercest hurricanes of political strife looks no longer to the compass or the clouds to guide us. And the Christian, as well as the sage and patriot of the Hermitage, who still prayed for his country after the power to do aught else had ceased, has gone to his great and glorious reward, while we linger a little longer to try to profit by his bright example." Jackson biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "Andrew Jackson devoted his life to making democracy possible and the Union indivisible." January of 1853 was the dedication of the Andrew Jackson equestrian statue, Jackson seated on a horse, made by Clark Mills at Lafayette Square in Washington City, just north of the White House. Stephen Douglas spoke to the crowd of 20,000 who gathered for the occasion and said, quote, "Andrew Jackson was left alone in the world at a tender age, without father or mother, brother or sister, friend or fortune to assist him. All was gone save the high qualities with which God had endowed him, and the noble precepts which a pious and sainted mother had infused in his young heart." Now, regarding Andrew Jackson's death, Douglas said, quote, "All felt that a great man had fallen, yet there was consolation in the consciousness that the luster of his name, the fame of his great deeds, and the results of his patriotic services would be preserved through all time, a rich inheritance to the devotee of freedom." Now, that Andrew Jackson statue is visible from the north portico of the White House. John Meacham wrote, quote, "They can see Jackson there, his sword within reach, ready to ride, ready to fight. There he is, a courageous man who could not rest, who risked everything and gave everything for his one great American family." At the base of the Jackson statue are Jackson's words, quote, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Stephen Douglas said, quote, "He still lives in the bright pages of history." Abraham Lincoln was inspired by Jackson. Lincoln said, quote, the right of a state to secede is not an open or debatable question. It was fully discussed in Jackson's time and denied by him. It is the duty of a president to execute the laws and maintain the existing government. He cannot entertain any proposition for dissolution or dismemberment. He was not elected for any such purpose. Of course, Jackson faced civil war and was ready for war with South Carolina. Of course, Lincoln actually had to prosecute a civil war to maintain the Union. 1929, Andrew Jackson's portrait replaced Grover Cleveland on the $20 bill. Harry Truman, who was president from 1945 up to 1953, was so absorbed by Jackson that when he was a young man, he was always off, reportedly, in a corner reading books about Jackson, rather than tending to the few customers in his haberdashery. December of 1945, President Truman said, quote, "It is well in this solemn hour that we bow to Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln, as we face our destiny with its hopes and fears, its burdens and responsibilities. Out of the past we shall gather wisdom and inspiration to chart our future course." I think that's still true today. Thomas Hart Benton, regarding Andrew Jackson, said, quote, "He was a firm believer in the goodness of a superintending providence, and in the eventual right judgment and justice of the people. I have seen him at the most desperate part of his fortunes, and never saw him waver in the belief that all would come right in the end." Jackson said, quote, "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me." Again, the story of the old soldier who lost a leg on a battlefield in the War of 1812, trying to keep his job as a postmastership, and reportedly voted against Andrew Jackson. And Jackson said, quote, "If he lost a leg fighting for his country, that is vote enough for me." For these 4 videos, I read 5 books. The first was Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times by H.W. Brands, 2005. American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House by John Meacham, 2008. Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, The Battle That Shaped America's Destiny by Brian Kilmeade and Don Yeager, 2017. The Life of Andrew Jackson, Robert V. Rimini, 1988, and Old Hickory, A Life of Andrew Jackson, Burke Davis, 1977. In conclusion, in my opinion, Andrew Jackson was a great man. He lived a life of service. His achievements included the victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, against American Indians, which led to safety for American settlers in what was at that time the West. His biggest achievement was the victory at New Orleans, January 8, 1815, against the British forces in the War of 1812, which helped earn respect from the British, who continued to be abusive after the American Revolution by kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. Jackson's role in Florida in becoming part of the United States when he went in to fight Seminole Indians and free blacks who were going on raids into the U.S. As president, the war with the U.S. Bank, which continues to be controversial, was then and is now, but he did it because he believed he was doing the right thing and that the U.S. Bank was corrupt. The Indian Removal Act, probably his most controversial action. Now, if Jackson had done nothing, there were large Indians in the what's now the Southeast occupied large areas of land, and it's believed that they would have lost that land eventually. And then where would they have gone? What would have happened to them? But by removing them to what's now Oklahoma, they had a place to go. Another major achievement was the South Carolina secession crisis, when the authorities in South Carolina decided to ignore federal law regarding the tariff and threaten secession, and Jackson was ready to go to war and to preserve the Union of the United States. God bless Andrew Jackson, a man who served his country well. Well, that concludes today's presentation. I hope you have a good history book to read, or you find a good history book. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray, at peterjray.com. So far, we have made 561 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. You also might consider checking out our podcast, Adventures in History, which you can listen to on Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care. And I'll see you next time.